Howdy, y'all, and welcome to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I'm your host for this episode and set of previews, Kodey Stoffer. And, on today's episode, I'm going to wrap up the teams that I have in the 5A classification. Once again, for those who are unfamiliar here, what we do when we preview teams is we talk about their last year recap, kind of talk about their record last year, some things that went well, some things that went maybe not their way. And we also talk about the seniors that graduated that contributed last year, as well as key returners for this upcoming season and project a window of wins for the upcoming season. So, I have the remainder of my 5A teams here. And then I also talk about some 4A teams as well as a couple of 3A teams just to kind of keep everyone on their toes. And this is coming out before next week where I will have an all 4A episode and, start to, after that, climb my way down the classifications 4A, 3A, 2A, and eventually my last episode, which is 1A. So let's go ahead and jump into this episode here, starting off with the Brighton Bulldogs. So, with the Bulldogs, they actually moved to 5A last season after being in 4A for as long as I can remember. They've been a time when they're in 5A and they've moved up and down, but at least to my knowledge, they've kind of always been a 4A team. But, they moved to 5A and it was a rough season with a lot of growing pains. I mean, they start off the season with a 5-game losing streak to good teams, mind you. Eagle Crest is a playoff team. Vista Peak, okay, maybe that one's not as good, but then Fossil Ridge, they only lose by a touchdown, and that is an eventual playoff team. They lose to Pooter, which was a competitive team on the 5A level. Then they do lose to kind of, I don't want to say crosstown, but they lose to at least a former rival in Broomfield pretty good from the 4A level before getting a 20-point win over Prairie View, which would be their only win this season as they would lose the rest of their league games. And, they were competitive. They only lost to Horizon by 6. They lost to Rangeview by 4. So, there were times where they showed that they could keep up, but just couldn't quite finish here. I mean, they have 4 losses by 7 points or less. So, I want to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and just kind of talk about how young this team was. But first, I'm going to talk about some of the contributors who are seniors who will not be returning to the fall season here. One of those was Avery Clark, second on the team in total tackles with 52 and was tied for the team lead in sacks with 2. Then you had Hayden Cuevas here, or Cuevas, who notched 46 total tackles and was the leader in tackles for loss last season with 4. And then the only other player with multiple sacks was senior Dylan Bravo Packer. And then 2 interceptions graduate with Dayton Dahlberg and Hector Sotelo. So it's crazy to think that this team really was so young last year because that's kind of where the end of graduating seniors come from, at least players that put up numbers, and I don't think that they really had anybody that was all-state caliber. So, they are returning a ton of talent in the form of rising juniors and in the form of rising senior talent. So, one of those talents is the interception leader, Isaiah Shep, who notched 2 interceptions and will return to a secondary in need of it. And, he'll also, more importantly, be kind of the crutch of this offense. He just seems like probably the best athlete on the team after last season, rushing for 10 touchdowns on 719 yards. And then also, fortunately for the Bulldogs, is that the leading tackler will return, Augustine Munoz, who had 62 tackles and was the leader in solo and assisted tackles as well. But I think that the big question mark here, is the passing game here that they really tried to invest into. Who, I mean, look, as a sophomore, Blake George, he looked very raw last season. And, his decision making was a bit rough. I mean, he threw 4 touchdowns to 10 interceptions, but one would hope that, a lot of these are going to be sophomore struggles, and that with all of the playing time that he did receive as a sophomore, that provided a ton of opportunity to learn. Watching the scheme, I actually kind of like what Brighton has going on here. They have, lots of motion. They run out of shotgun, and, their passing concepts really seem pretty all right. But I think that, the concepts look good, but the execution of them wasn't always pretty. And I would attribute that to the youth of this team. Sometimes routes were really close together, which I think is going to lead to interceptions. And, I also think that some of the reads that he's being asked to do, I mean, yeah, as a sophomore, you might make some mistakes, but I do think that, if he's studying the film, if he's learning from his mistakes, then he could really turn it around and succeed and thrive even in this system where he did show flashes. And hopefully another year he kind of like dialed in his mechanics and, can push the ball a bit further downfield. I think that his arm strength and his timing isn't necessarily the best, so he's going to have to be able to kill you in other ways. So, we'll see what George did in the offseason, because his 2 top receivers in Kwame and Day both return for this fall 2023 season. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that schedule for fall 2023 and just kind of talk about, the window of wins. This is the famous part, the wow here, and see how they're going to do. So they open up at home against Eagle Crest. Now, Eagle Crest is a team that is graduating a lot of talent, but talk about brutal tests to start the year. This squad has one of the best secondaries probably in 5A talent-wise, and it got even stronger over the offseason. So, that's going to be kind of a tough go for Brighton to open the year, and it's going to be a real test of George to see how far he has come as a passer. So then they have Vista Peak Prep. Vista Peak Prep, I think, is returning a lot of players, and I think they're a little bit more talented. I think that this one will come down to coaching. It was a very close game last year, but this one feels like a coin toss, but I'm leaning towards Vista Peak Prep. Fossil Ridge, once again, another team that graduates a ton of guys, but the talent that they are bringing that back is very talented. Pooter is, a consistent team. They were also kind of 50-50 with contributing seniors and returning playmakers. And then Broomfield, I think Broomfield is going to be really good again this year, honestly. So, while I am speaking praise of Brighton, I give them a coin toss for a win here in the non-league games, that is. And then as we turn to league, I think that Prairie View is a winnable game. I think that Mullen is probably not as winnable of a game. Same with Legacy. Both of those squads are going to be good. And, maybe Rangeview. So, unfortunately, despite returning a lot of talent, I still do think that the window of wins, I think that this team is probably too good to go winless here. But I'd say a window of wins of 1 to 4. If everything goes well, they could be Vista Peak Prep, Prairie View, Horizon, and Rangeview, maybe. But that has to be proven. I can't just give it. So we're going to give a window of wins to the Brighton Bulldogs of 1 to 4 here. But on the other end of the spectrum is a very, very talented 5A squad here who was, very successful last year and returns a lot of key pieces, with kind of a chameleonic, I don't know, I'm just making up words here, but you get the point. Fairview here went 9-1 in the regular season last year before getting upset in the first round of the playoffs behind, a crazy blackout game and kind of a bad lack of awareness and questionable coaching here when the lights were on and shining bright. But I digress here. I think that there is still a lot to be happy about. I think that they were maybe the only one-loss team that didn't have a bye, which you can feel some kind of way about. But at the end of the day, Chatfield still came into their house and upset them. But, they were pretty successful in league without too much trouble. I mean, they did scrape by with a 2-point win over Pooter that kind of pushed them with a solid secondary that they have. But other than that, I mean, they were just putting up crazy numbers against other teams, and their only loss during the regular season was against Valor Christian, who were the state runner-ups. So, I think that there's a lot to be happy about. But let's talk about some of the departing talent that is pretty high end, I would say. Because you have top 5 senior linebacker and their leading rusher, Zach Lewis, who graduates leaving behind 1,262 all-purpose yards and 18 total touchdowns in his wake. This doesn't even mention his team highs of 120 tackles, his team high of 18 tackles for loss. And, I think that it's important to note when talking about Zach Lewis that he was also a leader for this team. He was an emotional leader. He was a very smart football player. He was very dedicated to his craft. And yeah, this production and especially this kind of heartbeat for the Knights here is not going to be replaced by one player. It's just really not, and it's going to be a team effort to try and bounce back from the impact that Zach Lewis left on this Fairview squad. Another graduate here was Jack Lilly, an All-State honorable mention up front on offense, and, is kind of one of those guys from the past 2 years on this offensive line that was just very dominant, especially, being able to pass protect as well as set up the run. I think that this group last year set up the run even better than the group from 2 years ago. However, the group from 2 years ago was very strong in the pass protection game. So, over these past 2 years, they've gone through a handful of linemen, at least, graduated wise, that were very, very good and multifaceted. So, we have to see what the up and coming offensive line looks like and if they're going to be able to keep, that momentum going as far as being solid and proficient in multiple aspects of being a lineman here. And then I don't want to say last but not least, but Aiden Scott and Max Marco were a pair of seniors who contributed with a cumulative 5 scores and 500 plus yards receiving. But other than that, we got a lot of returning playmakers to talk about, so get excited, Knights fans, because this should be a good season for you. And, it's going to be very lengthy here with a very healthy 2025 class making up a very solid portion of the squad, maybe even a majority here, because you have Jordan Rochelle, who, has started since his freshman year, and his sophomore season, he was a beast. He had 1,680 all-purpose yards, being the leading receiver at 872 yards, and a stud tailback with 619 yards. So it's going to be interesting to see who leads the Knights in carries this season, since he and junior Ben Hawley both scored 6 touchdowns apiece on the ground, but they were also the leading receivers, with Hawley notching 570 yards and 2 scores himself. So I'm interested to see who is getting carries out of this backfield and how all of these offensive weapons are going to be used, especially because for his senior year, you will have quarterback Rowan Reisner, who performed solid in his first full year as a starter, throwing for almost 2,300 yards on 60% completion. But, he could cut back a little bit on the interceptions. We do like to see the 19 touchdowns, but the 11 interceptions is a bit on the higher end. So if he could cut back on turnovers and even add a few more touchdowns here and just get into rhythm a little bit faster, I think that would greatly benefit this Knights team. Now, continuing on to the defensive side of the ball, 3 of the top 5 tacklers on the squad were sophomores. They were in the class of 2025. I'm talking about Ryder Villarreal, who is second on the team with 101 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 4 pass breakups, and a fumble recovery. He's definitely a watch list level guy who is going to have a big impact, along with, fellow sophomore Wyatt Keegan. He was the name of this secondary, reaching an absurd 19 pass deflections, and, which was obviously the team high for Fairview in case that needed to be said. And then he also was the leader in interceptions with 2 to his name as an athletic corner who can cover inside and outside pass catchers, but is a bit on the smaller side and, is shown to be good at contesting, but not an ideal matchup against jump ball guys. It's just one thing that's different, but I mean, the ability to cover both slot and outside receivers at an efficient level and not bite on route fakes and stuff like that, I think is what makes him a very solid asset to this defense. And then you throw all of this on to, another player who had more total tackles than Wyatt, and that was fellow class of 25 stud Brock Kolstad, who had 75 tackles and 8 for loss. I mean, he is built. This guy is built like a brick house, and he also moves surprisingly well for his size and was very heads up with a team high 3 fumble recoveries. He's been working on his pass defense as well, so I think that that's probably going to take a stride forward this season, and he's just trying to be the next best overall linebacker here for Fairview. He was right there next to Zach Lewis last year, and now, he is going to be handed the keys to that defense as far as being that heartbeat in the middle. And, he plays violently, he plays fast, he plays hard, and, we'll see how that size kind of translates and what that looks like as he's just tasked with more responsibility this season. Now, another defensive dog coming up for his junior season is interior defensive lineman Keegan Field Gordon, who at 6'2", 295 pounds, moves with incredible force and presence with fast hands for engaging opposing linemen quickly. He's somebody who might see time on both sides of the ball with great size and a ferocious intensity between the hashes. So all in all, look, you have your leading offensive weapons coming back, excluding your running back. You have your quarterback coming back, and you have a lot of key pieces on all 3 levels of the defense coming back that show versatility and ability to have impact in multiple facets of the game. And so when I look at this defense, all in all, 6 of the top 8 tacklers are returning, with the oldest players being Diego Valdivieso and Jace Hines, who both had 35-plus tackles and recorded a tackle for loss, and Hines broke up 4 pass attempts as well. This defense should be a strength of this squad, and that this team should be as balanced as it's ever been, potentially, between offensive and defensive talent with a nice spread in that sophomore class. And, while they did graduate their MVP of last season, I still think that there's a lot of opportunities for the Knights to prove themselves as a true contender this year and have us excited at the prospect of a deeper playoff run than they've been allowed to or capable of these past 2 seasons. So they open up the season on the road in Highlands Ranch. Got to win this game. Lakewood, got to win this game. Valor Christian, this is going to be at Valor. I don't think that they win this game. This Valor team is returning a lot of junior talent, but I do think it'll be a good test for Fairview. And if they show, if they lose this game by like 7 points, I think that is very indicative of where this team is as far as contending for state. Now against Horizon has a new coach, but I do think that Fairview should still win this game. Against Douglas County, they should win that game. Pooter, they should win. Boulder, that's going to be brutal for Boulder here. Fort Collins, they should win. Fossil Ridge, they should win. And Rocky Mountain, they should win. They're going to be pushed a lot harder by Fort Collins this year. They're going to be pushed a lot harder by Fossil Ridge this year, I believe, as well. Rocky Mountain, that's probably going to be easier than last year. But, look, we're looking at another 9-1 season here. Maybe they get upset by somebody in league here. But I do think it's pretty safe to say that this team's window of wins is easily 7-9. I don't think that they go undefeated, because even if they do pull off an upset against Valor, I think that one of these league cats is still going to get them. So I'm going to say window of wins of 7-9, but 9-1 is going to be my exact record prediction for the Fairview Knights. So we're going to see if they can run it back and look even more dominant this year than they looked last year while posting the same record, and maybe try and get a first round bye depending on how, the committee views their strength of schedule. Moving on here, we just talked about this team as one of the matchups, and that is Horizon here. And look, this squad has hired its 3rd coach in just as many years, if not 4 years, trying to figure out how to make the talented aspects of this squad work cohesively. They went 3-7 last year, with those 3 wins all coming in league, making for a winning record in league, which is positive, and narrowly losing to Mullen, that was second in their league. But they took care of business against Rangeview and Brighton with close wins, and then absolutely, went off offensively with 51 points against Prairie View. So let's talk about some of the graduating seniors from this Horizon Hawks squad, starting with, 2 seniors. As the ground game wasn't super effective, they had 2 senior receivers that both put forth solid seasons. You got Landon Loomis, who had 688 yards and 5 touchdowns, and Xavier Stanley, who had 575 yards and a team-high 6 scores. This is very solid production, and there's going to have to be first-time starters that have to step up and fill these roles. Landon Loomis, great combination of speed and size, honestly, on both the offensive and defensive side of the ball, because he was the dude on defense with a team-high 69 tackles, nice, and a tackle for loss with an interception at his safety position. He played violently and he played fast, being able to close the distance between himself and receivers to make big-time pass breakups. And then Xander Anthony Katz was also a dog on this defense with 2 interceptions to his name, a fumble recovery to complement his 4th best 51 tackles and team leading 4 tackles for loss. So both of those guys impact players on, the defensive side of the ball. And then Xavier Stanley, obviously, that's a lot of touchdowns walking across the stage. Just between those 2 guys, that's 11 passing touchdowns. But, I want to say that those were probably the biggest contributors from the senior class. There's a lot of people who also graduated, but their numbers weren't crazy, which is going to be kind of similar to talking about the returning playmakers. But these ones that I'm going to talk about here are what is going to make anything work here for Horizon. Because you can't talk about Horizon without talking about Alex Birch, who, despite being undersized, improved from his freshman year and was asked to do more and obliged, with 23 combined scores through the air and ground and recording over 2,000 yards combined as well. So, he's somebody who can read a defense. I think that he's pretty mechanically sound as well. And, this year he was allowed to improvise a little bit more than last year. I want to say his freshman year, I should say, was very structured offense, very kind of flood-based. And, hey, you're supposed to throw it to this guy or this guy. Very simplistic. I think that, he was trusted to do a little bit more, and he was provided the, kind of leash, I guess, to scramble a lot more and just be a bit more of a playmaker, which he obliged with, obviously. And then, his top target heading into this season will be senior wideout Lucas Wilt, who notched 317 yards on 37 receptions and 4 scores, but will have way more opportunities to work vertically with Stanley and Loomis both graduating. And, I think that the ability is there. I think that his speed and route running have improved, just kind of observing him throughout the offseason. And, I know it's 7, so I don't want to put too much stock into it, but Lucas did improve and was able to put on, solid displays against national competition, which provides me with hope for this squad. So, we'll see what happens with the pads on, but, I think that, he's had a longer time now with an entire offseason to work at his receiver skills and, develop as that kind of player. Now, rushing the football here, like I said, not very efficient, but Titus Zhang was the leader in yards per carry behind this line last year after notching 330 yards. But, his line will have to step up to provide this balance, for the offense and for this offense to be just a bit more consistent on stringing together multiple drives. Senior lineman Tristan Salazar put in work last season, leading the team with 2 fumble recoveries and was second on the team with 57 tackles, and will be leaned on to lead this unit into next season that welcomes back fellow lineman Jordan Niles, who had 28 tackles, and a sophomore impact Jeremiah Martinez, who was third on the team with 51 tackles. So, you have some bits and pieces here and there trying to, put everything together for Horizon. And, there were times where they were close last year. They were very close in that Douglas County game. They were competitive for a lot of the Eagle Crest game. And, a lot of these games, Mullen is definitely a winnable football game, I would say. Looking back at last year, just cleaning up a few plays here and there. So, looking ahead to this season, look, last year I did come in a little too high with unproven assets and hopefully learn my lesson since this defense has a lot to show me. And so does the offensive line this season. But, with Birch, this team will still be one for opponents to take seriously, but they just haven't shown me the impact players at every position to project a deep run of some kind, as I was hoping that they were potentially a playoff team last year. But look, Douglas County, they played them close last year. They are returning their quarterback, I believe, down there at Doug Co. But they are graduating some weapons and whatnot. So I think that this will be an interesting test. It just stinks that you have to go all the way to Douglas County. So on the road, that's going to be a tough one. Eagle Crest, Eagle Crest is a team that did graduate a lot of talent, but this secondary is very talented. And, they do have playmakers kind of in the wings here for this squad. So I think that Eagle Crest, maybe not as easily as last year, just being able to lean on Diego Kearns, but I do think that Eagle Crest probably wins a narrow contest here. Now, Arvada West, this is a very young team, and I think that this is a winnable game, if I'm being completely honest with Horizon. I think that last year, Arvada West's experience was the big difference maker here, and I think that if you're Horizon, you just play a clean game, and you let these young players on Arvada West make mistakes. I mean, they're going to make plays too. Don't get me wrong. They're going to rip off long plays in this game, but I think if you play very disciplined football at home, this is a game that you could potentially win here. Now, against Fairview, as stated in my previous spot, I don't think that that's a winnable game. Rocky Mountain does feel like a winnable game. Mullen does feel like a winnable game. Rangeview does feel like a winnable game. Brighton does feel like a winnable game here. So, but I don't think that they beat Legacy. So the only losses that I'm quote unquote like guaranteeing, I guess, is against the likes of Fairview, Legacy, and Eagle Crest. So, but I do think that, with one of these coin toss games, maybe they don't quite finish it. But I think that on the low end, I think that they should beat Rocky Mountain, Mullen, Rangeview, and Brighton. I think that they should win 4 games. But, on the high end, I think that they could potentially win 6 games. So I'm going to give them a window of wins of 4-6 this year. I do think that the improvement is necessary, and I do think that it's possible. But we'll see what this new coach is about and if he has the chops to get the most out of the hand that he's dealt here. And hopefully try and make Horizon a bit more of a hot spot, in Thornton. I understand that that's kind of a tough area and that there's a handful of teams in that area or a handful of players, I should say, that could go to other schools. So I recognize that. But, at some point, you got to start winning football games with what you got. So let's see if this coach is the answer for the Horizon Hawks. And as for this next team, they're going to bring the storm with them here. I'm talking about the Legacy Lightning, who, last year they obviously, made upgrades at, the coaching position and on the staff. And, sometimes we are wrong. And I think Legacy was where I was the most wrong last season here. Because after dropping their first 2 games to Arapahoe and Lake Nona on the road in Florida, they righted the ship and won their last 8 games, scoring 40 or more multiple times, including in their playoff win over A West before losing a very close one to Pine Creek. This team did not start Jaden Carter, and so Colin Lorma is way more than I was projecting Carter to be looking at my recap last year, and I have noted that heading into this season. Now, that's not to say that they aren't losing some dogs on this squad here. They will be losing All-State honorable mention Owen Lee, who is at offensive tackle last season and is a loss for this O-line that routinely imposed their will. I think that losing leading receiver Will Thurston, who graduates after, a season where he led in receptions, yards, and touchdowns is going to be tough. 30 receptions, 599 yards, and 7 scores. That production is going to be tough to replace since, he was the spearhead or, the lightning bolt of that passing game here. Quinn Walker headlines 6 of the top 7 tacklers who graduate after recording a team second best 62 tackles with 3 tackles for loss and an interception as well, interestingly enough. Now, continuing on the defensive side of the ball, talking about some of these other leading tacklers, Noah Williams, he had 50 tackles and 4 for loss while also recording 2 interceptions his senior year. Marcus Romero was one of 3 seniors, including Williams and Christian Regner, to record 2 interceptions. And then the trio of Ryan Benerowicz. Oh my goodness. Sorry, Ryan. I'm going to just stop while I'm behind. Alex Gottschalk and Brandon Sanchez were very comfortable getting into the backfield with 25 combined tackles for loss and 9.5 sacks, along with their combined 112 tackles. They had some serious tenacity flying around the gridiron and making life a nightmare for opposing quarterbacks or ball carriers. Now, returning for them here, obviously, is still going to be some absolute studs. You get Omari Bursay, who led or was tied for the team lead on, tackles for loss with 9 of those to go with his team high 72 tackles and 53 of those being solo. This guy was a one-man wrecking crew who was doing the absolute most. And so that definitely lightens the load of, graduating all those seniors and all those numbers and all those tackles for loss when the leader in those categories does come back. Now, obviously, there's complementary stuff here, so you got to look towards rising juniors, Jake Hayes and Owen Westmeyer, who, as sophomores, both found themselves making tackles in the backfield 4 times a person. And then Kylan Studebaker put stud in his name with a team-high 4 interceptions last season to go along with a very solid 30 tackles. Now, on the offensive side of the ball, Colin Lerma, as I stated in last year's recap, was easily the biggest surprise on this Lightning team with electric efficiency and performances throughout the season, leading the squad and passing in rushing, both of those. On the ground, he had 928 rushing yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. And then he threw for another 1,400 yards and 17 scores. So, a 30-touchdown season. This was his first year as the full-time starter. So one can assume that he's only going to get better. He was electric and ripping off very long touchdown runs. I believe that he had a long of over 70 or 80 yards for rushing the football. And then, in the game that I did see against Mullen for Legacy, he was very efficient in, getting the ball to his receivers in space with the opportunity to make play. And he made it look really easy against the Mustangs in that game. Now, his 13 rushing touchdowns were tied with sophomore Tyler Anderson's effort last season, who himself had 808 rushing yards and, returns this season. And then Tyler Madden will probably see an uptick in production with his efficiency running routes from the slot and his solid junior campaign that saw him get 5 scores on 226 receiving yards, and building a rapport with Lerma that will serve as a security blanket this season. So, leading rusher, a very solid receiver, leading passer, leading tackler, leading tackle for loss, and then other pieces around both of those guys will be coming back. And, I think that there's not too much more you could ask for as far as a team that, is returning this amount of talent. And I think that they're going to be even better this season. They start off the season against Arapahoe, who I think is going to be better. But I do think that this is Legacy's game to lose, in my opinion, before they go on the road against Cherry Creek. That's going to be a very competitive football game. I'm not writing off Legacy's ability to win that football game. But for now, I think I got to err on the side of caution and give that to Creek before they end up with Rocky Mountain on the road. They should win that, and they should be 2-1 heading into an interesting 2-game stretch against Mountain Vista and Legend. I think that both of these teams are better than they were last year, so I don't think it's the worst thing if you go 1-1 in these games and you end up going 3-2, but it's very possible that you end up winning both of these with the talent that you have and going 4-1 into league play, where you shouldn't lose in league. You shouldn't lose in league. So, on the low end of wins, I think that they get 3 to start off and then go 5-0. So that makes their floor, look, at 1 year after projecting them to be bad, their floor is 8 wins and their ceiling really is 10 wins, if I'm being completely honest. Now, I should probably put in my projected window of wins at worst 7 and then at best 10. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 7 to 10 for this team. I just think that with the talent, with the coaching, and the staff, that this team is truly going to be a contender this year, and we'll see just how serious they are and how they do against Creek, Arapahoe, Vista, and Legend. I think that those games are going to be very revealing, but they're going to have to stay dialed in after their league play and be able to play back up against very talented teams. They pushed a Pine Creek team very closely last year, a Pine Creek team that went to the semifinals themselves. So I think that Legacy is going to be a serious threat to make a deep run in the 5A postseason this year behind a very, playmaking, high ceiling defense and behind an offense that's going to continue to, move the chains and also produce very big electrifying plays. It's just that, every other team I would say that they play outside of like Rocky Mountain is going to be better this season than last season and Cherry Creek, but Cherry Creek is not going to be like worse in like such a grandiose scale, right? So most teams that they play will be better and are returning a ton of junior talent and or transfers to really make for a more formidable schedule for Legacy to prove themselves as, true contenders. As for my last 5A team to preview, got to wait for Coach V and Gideon, obviously, for all of their clips and analysis once I'm done with all of my previews here in just a couple weeks. But Mullen here is the last team here, the Mustangs, if you would. And they're a team that, struggled to start this season, getting started a little slow here, jumping out to an 0-3 start against the likes of Columbine, Erie, and Santa Margarita. But then they bounced back with a win over Lakewood before losing to Pine Creek. I want to say that was the really foggy game. I might be mistaken. But after that, they finally string together. They win 4 of their last 5 games in their league. Their league being, a lot easier than the one they were in last year, that Jeffco one, with their only loss being kind of an embarrassing loss, if I'm going to be 100 with you. An embarrassing loss to Legacy at home. That is the game that I saw from Mullen this season. It was horrible to watch, and it was really boring. But anyways, they did make the playoffs, with, I want to say, a 500 record. And then they lost in the first round against Fossil Ridge, that was their very first playoff win in team history. So let's talk about some of the players who graduated this year and some of the guys coming back. So the Mustangs, they failed to establish a consistent pass game for the second year in a row, but the quarterback room is slightly less crowded with the graduation of Caleb Valdez Lemos, who, threw and ran for a combined 7 touchdowns and over 1,000 yards. Now, more importantly is kind of the stability of this offense. Aaron Waymeyer, who graduates after notching 162 carries for 1,149 yards and 10 scores. Aaron was also third on the team with 47 tackles and led the squad in interceptions with 2. And then 3 of Mullen's top 5 receivers in Aceves, Lewis, and Elms all graduate. Aceves reaching 595 yards, and the other 2 helping push this cumulative effort over 1,008 total scores. But not only did Ish Aceves notch a solid receiving performance, but he also led the team in tackles with 122 and 2 for loss. Cameron Lewis, as a corner from Riverdale Ridge, was 4th on the team with 40 tackles, but no recorded interceptions. Did have a handful of pass deflections here, kind of doing, his job on his island and whatnot as a stellar athlete. Hayden Woodruff was also an former All-State lineman who graduated and is playing ball on the collegiate level. But returning for the Mustangs here, is going to be the only other player to record an interception, which is Kevin Lewis. I assume that might be Cameron Lewis's younger sibling here, and that was a pick 6. So that's pretty awesome to have that playmaking ability in the secondary. And then AJ Guida here, or Guida, led the team with 3.5 sacks and 12 hurries last year, and will be accompanied by rising sophomore Nico DePazel here, who had 9 hurries himself and 2.5 sacks. And, just in general, AJ was a force with 104 total tackles and a team leading 9 tackles for loss. So, they're keeping some stability up front on that defensive line, which I think is very important and cannot be understated to be returning that talent across the big guys up front. And then one can assume that Ben Kurza will be under center this season after a season that saw him go 74 of 130 for 1,329 yards and a 14 touchdown to 6 interception ratio. And, not added on another 4 touchdowns on the ground. I wouldn't say that he's really a rushing threat, but, he can find the end zone and scramble a little bit if necessary. They're also going to be probably leaning a little bit more on freshman tailback Dante DePuch here, or DePuch, who had the second most carries on the team with 66 and produced 351 yards from it and 3 touchdowns. And the last kind of notable guy that I'm going to talk about here is leading receiver Jordan Leslie, who returns after a season that saw him record 677 yards and 4 touchdowns. So he's going to want to get into the end zone a little bit more, but that is very solid production here at the receiver position. So the thing about Mullen here, as I start to talk about their window of wins, is that they have talent. They have that. They always have talent every year, but they have to show, or what they have failed to show the past few years, is that they really don't have any idea how to use it and maximize it. And I can assume that this year will be much of the same, considering I saw a lot of players in their blowout loss to Legacy last season who will be returning. They open up against Columbine, they're not going to win this game. Then they have Erie on the road, they're not going to win that game. They do have Mountain Range and Lakewood, which are layups. I think that they should win both those games. I don't think that they beat Pine Creek, so they're 2-3 heading into league play. Horizon is going to push them a lot harder this year. This game is not a gimme. This game is a toss-up. Brighton, they should win that game. Legacy, they're not going to win that game. Prairie View and Rangeview, they should win those games. So you look at it, they should win at least 5 games, but I think that at max they win 6. I just don't really see them pulling off upsets this year. I would love to be proven wrong and for them to be able to put it together and, kind of show. I mean, they're a private school and they were once very dominant, so it's just weird to see this school that has such a luxury, a richness, a wealthness, an abundance of talent struggle the way that the Mustangs do. And, if they do get upset by any teams this year, they could on the low end be looking at 4 wins. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 4 to 6 for Mullen here, as, they just still haven't showed me enough to really hang with some of the best teams in the state of Colorado to this point. And with that being said, I'm going to turn the page here and talk about some 4A programs here. And the very first 4A program that I will be previewing is Thomas Jefferson, who actually were in their first year of 4A. I don't know if ever, of course, but they were in 4A for the first time this past season here, which is exciting for this squad. And, I think they're playing in that weird 5A, 4A hybrid league, which is, kind of a rough way to get started with things, since they did, start the season off against Pomona. That's obviously not the best draw in the world for any team. So, I think that that's important to kind of know and understand, is that they kind of went for a big bite right off the bat. But if they faced a Pomona squad from even like a few weeks later, I think that it would have been better than the 32-point loss that they experienced. But, following that, they put together a respectful season, and they hit my projected mark of wins. They end up going 4-6 on the season with wins over Wheat Ridge, Greeley West, Vista Peak Prep in a 1-point win, and against Liberty, while, kind of surprisingly pushing Ponderosa very hard on the 21st of October, losing only by a single point in what was a tough weather game, and showing that, they have grit to stick with some of the better teams. But they will be losing some serious talent this year, in my opinion. Herbie Martin is somebody who recorded 86 carries last season and was tied for the team lead with 9 touchdowns, but was third with 737 receiving yards, and was also the leading receiver, and all-inclusively had 1,432 all-purpose yards and 4 pass deflections. Now, Shafi Shabazz graduates and was tied for the team lead with 8 pass deflections with sophomore Joel Yaboa, who is no longer on this Jefferson squad. He's actually at Eagle Crest now and will be a part of that very dynamic secondary that they have over there. Now, Max Feynman here, he was third on the team in tackles with 67 and 4 tackles for loss. And then Dedrick Payne was very important to this Spartan squad on both sides of the ball, having racked up 5 tackles for loss and 64 total tackles while paving lanes open for tailbacks as a guard. I definitely think that he was more invested as an interior defensive lineman this past year, and so that's where the majority of his numbers and snaps came from, but is somebody that, showed potential and all league recognition in the past as an offensive lineman. So losing that versatility and utility really stinks up front. And then McCord Abram didn't always get to the quarterback, but he had a pretty zany 14 hurries last season. So it'll be hard to imagine him not notching probably 4 sacks and another 10 hurries should he be provided the opportunity this season with the Spartans. Now, paving lanes for the run game was All-State honorable mention Travion Johnson, who on the defensive side led the team in tackles for loss with 7 and notched 54 tackles. So, while one two-way lineman does go, Travion Johnson does return, which is going to be huge for Thomas Jefferson here. Jake Scobie led the team in tackles and returns. And then Jake Tapia also, was up there with this tackle leader in Jake Scobie. And, both of them had over 70 tackles and they combined for 3 tackles for loss. Tapia was, another head on this hydra of the rushing attack, notching a team high 935 yards and was tied for the team lead with 9 rushing touchdowns. Keyshawn Caesar here notched 50 tackles, but also led the squad in sacks with 3 and kept the heat on the quarterback with another 6 hurries. Jameer Ford led the team with 2 interceptions and had another 6 pass breakups to his name. So we're seeing guys on all 3 levels of this defense coming back to, make some contributions. And then more renowned for his offensive prowess, but still a contributor, is Dimitri Harambopoulos. After, 57 tackles and an interception last season on defense, that did not come near to outshining his 911-yard and 8 rushing touchdown season where he broke over 1,000 all-purpose yards. So, while they do graduate a running back and an offensive lineman, I do think that their defense should arguably be better than last season with all of these juniors returning for their senior season. And then, for the offense that TJ runs, Wing T, they have 2 of their rushing athletes, and I think that they'll be able to replace that third one very easily. They did not have a quarterback last year. Dimitri was kind of tasked with that. It didn't look good. It looked bad, actually. So I don't know if that's going to get any better from last year, but I do think that they're going to still remain competitive, relevant, and overall not end with the worst record in 4A, which is always a good thing. So against Pomona, I do think that they're going to be competitive in this game, actually, this time. I think that obviously Pomona, bigger talent pool there, but Thomas Jefferson, they have the talent to beat this team. They have the talent to beat Wheat Ridge once again. I'll talk about them here in a second. They'll have the talent to beat Greeley West. Bear Creek, don't think that they win that game. Stanley Lake, this one's a little bit more of a toss-up than it was last year. I think that last year, I was actually at this game. It was like the most rushing touchdowns I've ever seen by 2 teams combined. They were scoring like crazy, and it was a firework of a game for 2 teams that literally ran the ball all the time. And I think that, the big weakness of TJ in this game is that they were just getting gashed for 7 or 8 yards per carry. Stanley Lake, not as many great athletes coming back, but this one I will say is a bit more of a toss-up. Vista Peak Prep, I do think that Vista Peak Prep should probably actually beat Thomas Jefferson this year, and I'll talk about why in their segment coming up. But, could be tough. I mean, it's a league game. Now, Far Northeast Warriors, they are losing their best players, so I think that this game could be a lot more competitive and productive here. But, Far Northeast still has a really good, almost, not, I don't want to say exclusive talent pool, but they got a very solid talent pool. Now, Liberty, I think that school was kind of an anomaly last year in how well that they performed. I think that they should win that game. Ponderosa, I don't think that they win against. And Denver South is an interesting case here, but I do think that their defense is going to be amongst the best in 4A. So I think that that'll be enough to kind of put the lockdown on Thomas Jefferson. So at a bare minimum, I mean, there's just like 4 games on this schedule that I don't think that they lose. So I think that on the low end of things, I think that they win 4 games. But, on the high end of things, I think that this could be a squad that, wins up to 6 games. So I'm going to give them a window of wins of 4 to 6. And I say that they go 500 this year. I think that they are, a team that with, what they're returning on defense, as well as, the consistent offense that they can generate, this is a team that is going to be able to close the gap against a lot of these teams from last year and, compete against teams that were a little bit more on the senior heavy side, such as a Stanley Lake, such as, a far northeast, such as, I don't really want to say a Pomona, but, that team is going to be very, very young this year. So I think that that's all worth mentioning here in, my projected season for Thomas Jefferson. Staying in this league and continuing to discuss, I have Vista Peak Prep, who last season, or I should say 2 seasons ago, really graduated a ton of seniors. And, that led to its fair share of struggles this year as they go 2-8 with their only wins being against Brighton and Hinckley. But, they lose literally a 1-point game against both Thomas Jefferson and Far Northeast. And then, they lose a 10-point game to Rangeview to start the season. Rangeview being a definitive 5A squad. But, that's that just put them behind the 8 ball a little bit. But I think that they'll bounce back. But some of the guys who won't be here for the bounce back from that class of 2023 is going to be, leading receiver Daquan McClellan here, who graduated. But fortunately, doesn't take a ton of yards with him, but does take a team-high 2 receiving scores. As discussed in last year's preview, and this is a pretty tough loss actually for the Bison, is Ezekiel Taylor. I said that he was going to be leaned on very heavily to take a step forward for this defense to remain relevant, and that was really true because he had a team second best 81 tackles and recorded a team best 5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, and was tied for a team best 2 forced fumbles. So Ezekiel Taylor was the force that I was projecting him to be on the defensive side of the ball, and it's going to hurt to miss a defender that was able to just do so many things right for this squad. Then 2 seniors who recorded an interception out of the 3 total was Anthony Sotelo-Lares and Caleb Moore with 45 tackles, who both made their presence felt. And, these fellows both had scoop and runs, I should say, of 40 yards, with Moore's finding pay dirt, I'm for sure. Daquan McClellan on the defensive side of the ball was also solid, recovering 2 fumbles. But, I'd say a lot of the struggle for this team last year was identifying who is the guy under center. And after a rotation of quarterbacks and a lot of interceptions, I think that rising sophomore Owen Packer, despite throwing as many interceptions as touchdowns and struggling with the deep ball, was the most consistent passer from last season. And, that gives them a few years to, build and develop Owen rather than turning to one of their 2 turnover prone juniors from last season. So I think that you hand the keys to sophomore Owen Packer and just kind of let him grow, let him develop, and let him continue to, make mistakes, but grow from them as well with plenty of time to correct those mistakes over the course of his high school career. Now, Colton Johnson Jr. was the leading scorer on the squad with 10 rushing scores on 94 carries and will probably be tasked with an even heavier workload as a senior, and I think is going to be a guy that should break the 1,000-yard barrier. On the defensive side, you have the leading tackler in solo tackles, assists, and total tackles in Amondo Johnson, who did all this despite only playing 9 games his junior season. So, his 87 tackles will probably jump to about 100 should he remain healthy, or should his stats be recorded for an entire 10 games, whichever is the case. Joshua L. Bodu was third on this team with only 46 tackles, but will be leaned on to take a step forward with 7 of the top 9 tacklers graduating. But when he did hit, he brought the pain with a team-high 2 forced fumbles. And last but not least, Marcel Evans Jr. had an interception and will probably be the premier receiver and returning threat, as in at kickoff and punt return for the Bison this season, after the majority of his all-purpose yards were on kick returns. So you got an athlete to work with here. Now, let's go ahead and jump ahead to this 2023 season and take a look at the schedule here. Obviously, most of these schedules are the same, but flipped on home or away. So they got Rangeview this year. I think that this is a winnable game, and it's one that hopefully, with all their returning talent, they can pull off. Brighton's kind of in the exact same boat, honestly, as Vista Peak Prep as far as returning a younger quarterback that struggled with turning the ball over and then, contributing pieces around them. Broomfield, I don't think that they win this game. Skyline is graduating a lot of talent, but that's still a very talented squad. Vista Ridge, I think, is probably a game that they don't win. Thomas Jefferson, I think that Thomas Jefferson's just maybe a little bit more consistent, but, on the high end, I think that Vista Peak Prep has, the ability to go boom or bust. So actually, I'm going to give that as a win to Thomas Jefferson retroactively here, and just keep that window of wins the same. Ponderosa, competitive, but I don't think that they win that game. Denver South, this defense is going to be suffocating for a very young offense. And then Hinckley and Far Northeast, I think that those are winnable games as well. So I'd say on the low end, they do win 2 or 3 games. And on the high end, they string together wins against teams with a ton of departing talent. And I think that they could maybe win 5. So I'm going to give them a window of wins of 2 to 5. I don't think that they win less than 2. And if they do, then that makes for a disappointing season for the Vista Peak Prep Bison. Now, not my last 4A team period. Like I said, I will have an entire episode of 4A teams coming out on Monday. But this is the last 4A team for this episode before I talk about some 3A programs. And that is going to be, kind of the golden child of this league. That is Denver South, who, look, after a very hot start to this season where we saw, a Skyline team that we had projected to be good, and they were eventually a playoff team, not be able to keep up with the likes of this, lava hot pyroclastic flow of an offense that they had here at Denver South. This was going to be a common occurrence watching Joseph Capra score touchdowns at will and doing what he would like for the rest of the season, with the Ravens' only loss being a 1-point loss to Golden before running into a red-hot Erie team and, an undisciplined defense here for the Ravens kind of results in their season ending a little bit sooner than they hoped. So, notable wins, Skyline, Longmont, they both score over 40 points in those games. They score over 40 points in their one loss to Golden that year that had a very talented quarterback themselves. They get a very convincing win over Ponderosa in Parker that Simon and I were both able to attend, watching Capra and Shad Caldwell do their thing there. And then, that was kind of it, honestly, since their league play. They kind of just breezed through pretty easily. So they were the league champs here, even in a league with Ponderosa. Went 9-1, had the first week bye for the postseason, and then Erie was just on fire and, came in there and kind of put it to them. Kind of, reminding everyone that Denver South has struggled mightily when it comes to the postseason these past few years. And these graduating seniors are not going to help that case should they be able to make the postseason this year. So, I think that you can't talk about it without the name that I already mentioned in the last year's recap, and that's dual sport GOAT Joseph Capra here, who graduates after a high school career that saw him win multiple Playmaker of the Week awards, constant contention for end of the year awards or, PMC's all Playmaker team. And he was a top 5 senior quarterback in our list where we assess film and give people a grade. And, he had 62 passing touchdowns to pair with 25 rushing touchdowns. And the fear he striked into the heart of every opponent he played in a high school career that saw him reach over 6,000 yards, that's just not replaceable. Really, if we're trying to be realistic here, that is not production that you can just find on the street. And that is going to be a valiant effort on the Ravens' behalf to try and compensate for, if I'm being completely honest, and I don't even know if it's possible. And this doesn't even include the top 4 receivers that Capra was passing to, who all graduate and have a chance to reflect on a solid senior season, especially the triplet of Jake Perucio, who had 384 yards, 5 scores, CJ Morm, who is 25 yards shy of 500 and 4 touchdowns, and the headliner, Roadrunner Caldwell, at 737 yards and 14 receiving touchdowns as the premier deep threat on the squad. Now, I'm going to jump to the defensive side of the ball and talk about some guys who graduate. Levi Headland was the go-to ball hawk on the defense with a team high 4 picks and even scooped up a fumble as well. So that's a whopping 5 turnovers brought to you by one guy. You also have O.J. Thomas, who is the leading tackler in the class of 2023 and had 2 interceptions to his name as well. Sharif Boyland was second on the squad with 6 tackles for loss out of his 24 total tackles and takes those across the stage. Demaje Wells had a solid season against the pass with the team's second best 3 deflections and an interception to go with it. And then second team All-State offensive lineman Andrew Back graduates as well. So offensively, you are losing the best player on your offense. You're losing everyone who basically caught a touchdown from him. And then on defense, you're losing some pieces. But the defense is actually the thing that's going to keep Denver South relevant here. And here's why. You got Jeremiah Emery, who didn't have the most tackles on the team. When you start discussing who got in the backfield, he was that guy with 8 tackles for loss and 2 sacks that makes him someone to fear heading into his senior season. J.R. Felipe was someone else harassing ball carriers with 5 tackles for loss and 33 additional tackles. But the leading tackler of this team was junior Brooks Vitale, who had 76 total tackles and 5 for loss, while being tied for the team lead in sacks with 3. So just 3 guys that are all going to dominate up front here in that front 7. And this is paired with Andrew Shepard, who is third on the squad with 40 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, and was tied for the most sacks on the team with 3. So another front 7 contributor. And then Alex Van Stel is another highlight of a pass rusher coming back with 2.5 sacks for a squad that brings back 13 of their 18 sacks last year. So this front 7 is going to be hard to run against, and it's going to be hard to get passes off. While they are losing contributors from their secondary, I think that it is important to know that quarterbacks are not going to have a lot of time to set their feet and really read the field for, this Denver South squad. And, that's something that they should be excited for to limit in multiple capacities. And then, while they don't necessarily, or I don't know who's up next at quarterback, they will have a little bit easier of a time since they will have the benefit of a very solid backfield, and they'll get to rely on 2 senior backs who combined for over 1,000 yards in the form of the quick but smaller Orlando Gavera, who runs with a pop, and the more volume-laden senior Chevelle Early, who had 10 rushing scores and has been the starter since his sophomore year. So I think that Denver South's formula to success is going to be running the ball really well and then playing very stingent defense. So with that formula, I think that you're going to end up winning some games here. I think that, you kind of have a toss-up against Skyline, but I think that this is a winnable game, especially since it'll be at home this time. I think that they should still probably beat Denver East. Longmont is a team that I think is going to take a significant step forward this season, but, that younger offense will be put to the test because I think it will be a bit of a younger squad, obviously older than last year, but, they are losing some very top-end talent across that offensive line, and Denver South is bringing back top talent to the defensive line. So, that one's a toss-up. Golden, I think that this is probably a game that, with the pieces that Denver South has, they should probably win this year. They probably should have won it last year, if I'm being honest. But, especially with, the majority of those 43 points from Golden coming from one guy, I think that they should be able to bounce this back. Cheyenne Mountain, they should be able to win that game. Ponderosa, this one should be a toss-up here. I'll probably lean Denver South, but wouldn't be surprised if Ponderosa wins. Gateway, that's a win. Vista Peak Prep, that's a win. Far Northeast, that's a win. And Thomas Jefferson, that probably should be a win. But Thomas Jefferson could actually beat them this year. So I think on the low end, the games that they absolutely will not lose puts them at about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I want to say around 5. I don't know if they go undefeated. So I'm going to say that they win 6 to 8 games this year. I think that there's some growing pains without knowing who the quarterback is going to be. But, I think that they should still probably be a postseason team, but not one that has a bye week like they did last year. I just don't see that happening for the second year in a row, especially given what they have lost in the offensive production of Capra. I think that, the growing pains early in the season are going to be a little bit more brutal than later in the season when they've had time to adjust and adapt to a weaker league. So that's my take on the Denver South Ravens. Once again, window of wins of 4-6. And that wraps up the 4A classification on this episode. And now I just have 2 3A teams here. The first one being the Wheat Ridge Farmers here, where 3A was way more kind to them than when they were in 4A just a couple seasons ago. And they finished 3-7, but they were at the wrong end of some pretty bad blowouts. So, talking about guys who graduated, you have the leading passer, Sam Christensen, who attempted 200 passes last season for almost 1,700 yards, but was a bit turnover prone. You also lose the top 3 rushers of Archuleta, Christensen, the quarterback, and Gassman. Those guys combined for over 1,000 yards and over 10 scores that all need to be replaced. And then, as discussed heading into the season last year, Ezekiel Estrada was that guy. He was a stud for the defense with 93 total tackles, but not as many seniors made up the top of the list, with only Javin Schultz and Moses Archuleta being in the top 7 tacklers with 41 and 48 tackles respectively, and a pretty minimal impact in tackles for loss. So when we look at the defense here, they had a pretty healthy underclassmen representation, especially with Angel Bueno, who is second on the squad with 86 tackles and notched a team-high 11.5 tackles for loss on a team where no one else even had double-digit performance like that. And then you have a pair of juniors who took the 3 and 4 spots in tackling with Frank Erickson and Nick Dalton, both of them notching over a half century of tackles, and they combined for 7.5 tackles for loss. There's an exciting class of, what does that make a freshman from last year? 20, if they're first year, they're 22, 23, 24, 25. Counting out loud here, I believe this is a class of 2025. No. I literally just time traveled to 2022. That is not how time works. So this is actually a class of 2027, guys. Surprise, surprise. I know how to count. And, as a freshman, Nate Treon Jr. made his presence felt with 37 tackles and 2.5 for loss in only 8 played games. So, making the most of the time once he did earn that playing time, and probably cementing himself as having a starting spot for Wheat Ridge for the foreseeable future. Isaac McCune was also phenomenal on the defensive side of the ball with 4 interceptions and tallying 105 yards on returns. And then, there's some stellar athletes returning to the offensive side. 2 class of 25 receivers shined on this squad between Bennett Wilkes and, once again, Isaac McCune here, who had 714 and 595 yards apiece. And McCune led all receivers with 5 receiving scores. So whoever is next up throwing the football will have, 2 surefire receiving threats with solid volume ready to go. But we don't know who that quarterback is going to be. That's a huge question mark. And will that quarterback be able to get these guys the ball? So, in this season, they start off on the road against Fort Lupton. So the fact that they won by 1 point and now they have to go to Fort Lupton is going to be tough. I do think that with the defense that they have, they should probably still be able to win this game. Thomas Jefferson, I don't see it. Denver North, I don't see it. Sand Creek, this is an interesting one because, they are, playing against very different competition throughout the season. And, they did themselves also have a 2-8 season last year. They lost to Wheat Ridge last year at home. So I think that Wheat Ridge probably gets it done having home field advantage. Summit, that's a team that graduates a lot of talent, but I still think at their baseline is a better ran program than Wheat Ridge. Same with Conifer. And then I'm going to talk about Skyview here, who, is returning a lot. So I think that Skyview probably wins this game. And I don't know if Wheat Ridge wins another game between Green Mountain, Evergreen, and Littleton. So I have their window of wins between 1 to 3. I think that they definitely win one of their games against the likes of Fort Lupton or Sand Creek. And, they probably go 1-9 this year if I'm being entirely honest. But I'd be happy with 2-8. So, but I don't think that they go winless. I think that they have enough talent on the defense to not go winless. And I think that they have enough athletes to scrape together something, anything on the offensive side of the ball to be relevant Now they don't have a Dave Logan over there like they did back in the day, but I still think that this will be an interesting season for this farmer team. Which, what a name, by the way. I digress. And that brings us to the last team on this episode. That is the Skyview Wolverines, who did exceed expectations in some way, going 3-7 last season. And, actually recorded stats so that I could really talk about this team a lot more this year than I did last year. But, in their games last year, they, like I said, they went 3-7, but started off the season with back-to-back wins, a 12-6 win over 4A Thornton, and then a massive 40-point win over Sierra here to start the season. So they had to be stoked about that. This Niwot team does get the better of Skyview 15-6 here before Adams City also beats them by about 16 points. They lose to Denver North that has a very talented quarterback, and Littleton that was very stacked last season as far as Littleton talent goes, before bouncing back with a huge win over Wheat Ridge, and then the toughest three teams in their league, Evergreen, Conifer, and Green Mountain, they don't really hang with. But, I think that it's encouraging to see the way that they were competing, and then to look at this team and who they're bringing back. There's reason to be excited for the Wolverines this season, honestly. But, let's go ahead and talk about some of the seniors who did graduate and some of the things to not be excited about. Micah Grossman Jackson led this team with 48 tackles and graduates. Marcus Gonzalez was third on the team with 40 tackles and 2 tackles for loss. And then 38 tackles was good enough for fourth best on the squad for Wyatt Espino, who also had a team second best 2 interceptions while notching 113 return yards on those interceptions and 3 pass deflections. So definitely a nice athlete in Espino who will not be back in the fold last year. Leading the way in Xavier Crispin was tackles for loss, who collected 6, which was triple the next leader in tackles for loss. And this squad also graduates 75% of their sacks, with Grossman Jackson, Espino, Crispin, and Gonzalez all having 2 sacks and walking across the stage. And then last but not least, Skylar Flamenco was heads up, jumping on, loose balls for 2 of them, which was tied for the best on the squad. But returning playmakers, notice how I didn't really talk about any offensive guys who are really graduating, because this team is returning, their leading rusher, receiver, and quarterbacks who, all notched time and all recorded stats. They will all be returning. Bryson Gutierrez led the team in attempts, yards, and passing touchdowns, but also threw more interceptions than passing touchdowns. So it'll be interesting to see if that was a bad enough season to let rising sophomore Carlos Carrillo compete this year. I think that they're still probably going to roll with Bryson to start, but I think that his leash is a little bit shorter than it was last year, since they kind of know what they have in Carlos Carrillo, and he has shown to, put together some flashes at the quarterback position. But doing the heavy lifting for this team and being the heartbeat of the offense is going to be Omar Loza here. He ran for 1,300 yards, 20 rushing touchdowns, and averaged almost 7 yards per carry. And, he's going to make whoever's job it is under center a lot easier, because, when the going gets rough or the going gets tough, the tough get going. And Omar Loza is that guy. He is definitely a watch list guy, and somebody who I'm excited to see, heading into this season here. Now, Danny Reyes, he was a complimentary back. He was the second leading rusher at 354 yards, but also was the return specialist with close to 250 yards returning the football. And this combined with fellow juniors' return game of over 400 yards and Christian Ortiz, they have 2 athletes that they can really scheme into their offense and become very multifaceted on, the defensive side of the ball, and especially winning in special teams. If you can win in special teams, you only have to win in one more facet of the game. So, when you have guys that can return the ball and are explosive athletes, that makes, the rest of the life of the defense and the offense significantly easier, especially if they're able to generate those big plays on the offensive side of the ball as well. Now, on defense, you have Milton Samuel Cortez, who led the team with on offense at receiver,
You have Milton Samuel Cortez, who led the team with 3 out of 5 total receiving touchdowns on solid efficiency of 343 yards on 15 receptions. Now, Ruben Peraza was second on the team with 44 tackles, and he returns to the fold, as does John Singleton, who is a harbinger of bad news for opposing offenses, in that secondary, in that defensive backfield. 3 interceptions and 5 pass deflections, who only enters his junior year. So he was doing this as a sophomore. He's only going to be faster, and he's going to be significantly bigger. So I think that his tackles should see an uptick, and he'll be able to potentially, throw that shoulder down and be asked to do a little bit more for this defense. So looking ahead, it's nice to see that they're returning like their entire offense. I think that Thornton is once again a very winnable game here. I think that Sierra, they do have Micah Lumpkins, who is an absolute beast, but I don't know if other returning talent means that you're going to close a 40-point gap. Niwa is a team that I'm very interested to study, and is a team that really relied on very few players last year. So, I think that this is a winnable game for this, squad here. Adams City, this is a team that I just researched for an upcoming episode. So be sure, once again, to just stay tuned for, all of the teams that, I'm going to be previewing these next couple weeks. And Adams City, they do graduate. What little talent they did have last season, they are graduating. And, I think that that's going to be a very tough draw for this team here. So, Adams City, I think, is a winnable football game, but it's not going to be easy. That's going to be one that Skyview's going to have to grind for. Denver North, they're coming back with Frankie Dardano. I think that he's one of the more solid and consistent junior quarterbacks. So I think that, they probably win that game. Littleton, despite Littleton's major graduation, I think that the new staff that they have in there is going to change the culture truly this time at Littleton, and I think they're committed to it. Wheat Ridge, this is a game that they should win before Evergreen, Conifer, Green Mountain. I think that they close the gap in these games. I just don't know if they're winnable. So I say on the low end, Skyview at least wins 2 football games, but I think that they can win up to 5 football games and maybe squeak out a 500 season. I still don't think that would be good enough for the postseason with the strength of schedule, but it would be a huge emotional victory for this team that, has, struggled pretty mightily these past few years and could really benefit from a solid season, especially with the studs that they have on both sides of the football. But with all of that being said, that will conclude this episode of Playmakers Corner here. This is episode 272. Be sure to, or 273, my bad. It's episode 273, recorded on July 7th. So take it easy on me if I missed any news as well. And go ahead and comment your feedback on our season previews on whether we're going to be right, wrong, on the nose, or completely, off the mark. Be sure to let us know what the takes that you agree with, as well as, shout out or point out any of those players that did, get mentioned on this episode. We are always here to try and cover the talent. And so, it is our pleasure and honor to be covering this. And you can comment your thoughts anywhere on social media, whether that be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. Go ahead and follow us on all of those, or you can leave comments on the YouTube video posting of this episode as well. And if you're on any of those, be sure to follow us or subscribe so you know when we have new episodes coming out, as we have graphics that we post. And then we're constantly sharing talent, especially on our Twitter and Instagram feeds, retweeting players from Colorado to be on the lookout for, as well as some other content as well. So please follow us at Playmakers Corner on Instagram, Playmakers Corner on YouTube, Playmakers Corner on Facebook, or at Playmaker Corner on Twitter. And be sure to listen to any episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts for all notifications. Go ahead and mess with your notifications there so you get notified when we release new episodes. And then go ahead and enjoy the graphic in its full size, scale, and beauty on Twitter or Instagram. But I have been your host for this episode, Kodey Stauffer, and stay tuned next week where I have another set of 3 previews and the week after that. Thanks and peace.